Alrighty, good evening, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Virtual CAAM. My name is Alexandra Mitchell. I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at CAAM. We are delighted that you've chosen to spend part of your evening with us. As a collective, many of us are dealing with the difficult realities in the wake of the Breonna Taylor indictment, and I want to let you all know that we stand with you and hope to continue to produce work that highlights, celebrates, and creates safe spaces for Black women artists and beyond. Tonight, we are joined by CAAM's Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Cameron Shaw, and artist Nikita Gale as they discuss the development of Nikita Gale's private dancer exhibition at CAAM from concept to installation, including how theoretical aspects of the exhibition were brought to life as they use technology to navigate the impact of COVID-19 on the artistic and curatorial process. Gale's first solo show, Private Dancer, examines the shared experience of music concerts as a starting point for questioning more abstract ideas of spectacle, desire, and refusal. In a recent interview with Hyperallergic, Gale is quoted as being interested in the political function of silence and noise. When we speak of sound, we are speaking of touch, Gale notes. So we speak of listening, we are also speaking of being touched and of feeling. In the installation at CAAM, theatrical lighting tresses and transformed into unique sculpture and programmed lights dance to an unheard soundtrack of music by Tina Turner, an icon and the artist we all know and love, who she's been referencing for over 6 years. A quite unique and nuanced approach to ideas around Black performativity, the Black body, celebrity, and silence as a political position. Nikita Gale is an artist living and working in Los Angeles, California, and holds a BA in anthropology with an emphasis on archaeological studies from Yale University, and earned an MFA in new genres at UCLA. Gale's practice is often structured by long-term obsessions with specific objects and the ways these objects gesture towards social and political histories. Gale uses various technologies as frameworks to consider how individuals potentially reproduce their own relationships to objects within their relationships to political, social, and economic systems. By engaging with material that have properties that are simultaneously acoustic and protective, Gale's recent work considers the role of audience as a social arena and examines the ways in which silence and noise function as political positions and conditions. Cameron Shaw is the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at CAAM, where she guides the curatorial and education departments, as well as marketing and communications. Shaw was previously the co-founder and executive director of New Orleans-based Pelican Bomb, a nonprofit contemporary art organization that presented a form of exhibitions, public programs, and arts journalism. Her writing has been widely published, including the New York Times, Art in America, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Bow Magazine, as well as numerous books and exhibition catalogs. She was awarded the highly coveted Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for short form writing in 2009, and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation Art in America Writing Fellowship in 2015. We invite you to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen tonight to engage Nikita and Cameron in regards to the program and tonight's exhibition talk and related questions. And we look forward to welcoming you back to CAAM when we reopen. And with that, I'd like to open the program to Nikita and Cameron.
Thanks, Alexandra. And thank you, Nikita, for being here with us tonight. And thanks to everyone who is here on the Zoom sharing your energy and time, especially during this very difficult moment for everyone. Nikita, I know you wanted to share a few words before we begin our conversation, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for being with us this evening. It's so great to be here. Thanks for holding the space for this. I first wanted to just extend a land acknowledgement before we got started, even in this kind of like digital abstract space, as we are all in various parts of Los Angeles right now. And just briefly say that we acknowledge that we are guests in the homeland territory of the Tongva. And so we wanted to extend our respect and gratitude to the many indigenous communities who call this land home. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikita.
Yeah.
We're here to talk about your practice tonight, in particular, Nikita Gale, Private Dancer, an exhibition we began installing in the early phase of the pandemic, and
Yeah.
nobody has gotten a chance to experience in person. So our museum has been closed since March 13th, along with museums throughout Los Angeles. We look forward to opening up soon, we hope, and welcoming people to your exhibition. But I thought it would be good for us to just start with you sharing some install images, and you can walk us through what viewers would see and experience in the gallery.
Yeah, let me, I'm gonna share my screen right now. Might just take me a minute. Hold on. This is always the weird waiting period. Okay, here we go. It should be working. Oh. Okay, how's that?
We can see you, you're good.
Great. All right, so I was just gonna show some images, some install images of the exhibition, kind of walk you through what you're looking at right now. So this is like a sort of a tight shot of the sculpture, of the private dancer sculpture. And so the materials that I've used are essentially these lighting trusses, typically the kinds of materials you would see at like a live show or a live concert, but they've been kind of stacked and turned into this deconstructed ruin almost. Here's a video as well that I'm gonna play. And so the lights are activated by the sound of Tina Turner's Private Dancer album, which came out in 1984. It was her first major kind of solo success post the Ike and Tina Turner review years. And so the lights are programmed to respond to all of the sounds and different frequencies of that album. So it's about a 46 minute looping kind of performance of this lighting system that you're seeing. It's completely silent. So all you hear is basically like the creaking of the lights and the movement of the equipment itself in the space. And then of course, whatever sounds you might be making as a viewer as you're walking around in the space. Here are a couple
Nikita,
more
can you talk
sounds.
about your collaboration with Josephine Wang, the lighting designer who helped you
Yeah.
with this exhibition?
Absolutely. That was working with Josephine. This would not have been possible without her technical expertise. So Josephine and I met, oh my gosh, I think it must have been over a year ago when we were both working at the Natural History Museum in kind of like different parts of the AV team. But Josephine's a really incredibly accomplished lighting designer who's worked on some really amazing arts projects. And so I reached out to Josephine because she was the first person I thought of when I had this idea for the project. And through sort of like this collaborative effort, we put together this piece. So Josephine handled the vast majority of the technical aspects. So the programming that was created is kind of like a custom program that reads the various frequencies of the songs. And so she created it so that it was sort of more legible for me on my end to make little adjustments to say like, oh, like I want this frequency to do this specific thing with the lights, or I want the lights to get brighter on this bass part. And so it was really fantastic working with her. And I really do think of this as like a collaborative project as well. So it was really great to just kind of have those moments when we were able to kind of get into the space socially distanced and with masks, of course, to kind of get everything wrapped up. It was really nice to kind of work together.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that install process that you were just mentioning.
Yeah.
So we were set to open this in the second week of March, and preceding that, during our install period, you fell ill. It was the beginning of the pandemic. COVID tests were not readily available. folks didn't know what we were truly going to be entering into. We had not yet entered into quarantine, but we knew in an abundance of caution that you should not be on site installing an exhibition, but we didn't know yet that museums would be closing. So we were still pushing forward with an install, but you were at home on FaceTime. So I'd like to hear from you as an artist, what that felt like from your perspective. I was in the gallery with our install team. Nikita was on FaceTime. We were just walking around in circles. I was working with a little drawing that Nikita had sketched off to start to think about the ways in which the actual trusses would lay on one another. And we were just figuring it out because we had no other choice. Can you talk about how that felt for you as an artist to think about a remote install?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because it's not unusual for me to remotely install something, but it is unusual to remotely install something for the first time. So that was the thing that I think was especially sort of disorienting, is that I had just gotten back to LA after being in New York for 2 weeks, where I did this performance project at PS1 called Audiencing, which I think a lot of the themes in that show are closely related to this one as well. But I got back to LA, and a few days later, I just started to feel a little tired. You know, I just felt like a little not so well. And at that point, no one really knew what all of the official symptoms were. It was just a lot of guessing and not being sure. And so out of caution, we decided to just keep it remote. And so it was great. Like, I appreciated the fact that you and Josephine were there, especially Josephine. She did a lot of the legwork in like setting up the lights and getting all that sort of like attached and everything. But it was a very kind of, you know, it's an exercise of trust, I think, in those situations, especially as like a first install. And I think that you and I have like had several really good conversations where it was like we were clearly meeting eye to eye on a lot of things. So I felt really comfortable in that regard in terms of just having to do it remotely. But it is really strange when you're doing it remotely and you're only, I think I don't even live like 5 miles away from CAAM. And so that part felt a little, you know, disorienting is the best word I have for it. I feel like I've been using that word for a lot of things, to describe a lot of things right now.
But it also felt for me in a strange way like it was an extension of the work, right? One of the many things that this work references is, and that much of your practice references, is the role that technology plays in delimiting the body or extending the limits of the body. And this was a way in which technology was actually allowing us to do something to extend the limits of our own bodies, because we could not be in the space together, but in a way that it just felt like, oh my gosh, this work is actually coming to life in a very surreal way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I like that sort of like where you're going with this idea of like the way that technology creates limits or extends the body in various ways. Because like when you think about FaceTime, for example, or that sort of like calling technology, it does this thing where it compresses, there's like this compression of space, right, that happens, or this compression of distance that was really,
or even right now, we're just like, we've gotten so used to people just being like busts or heads that are, you know,
in their rooms. And so, like, it's really interesting how those themes sort of came up just through the production of the work. It's a good point, because what I was thinking about with this work, like one of the main themes is sort of this question of what constitutes a performance or what constitutes presence, and how can absence or the absence of a figure actually become a kind of protective gesture. And like specifically in that instance, like my not being present was actually a way of keeping everyone else in the space safe, which is like a more literal way of reading it, I think. But also, like when I think about this question of absence and presence, or like a lack of visibility or hiding a figure, like I actually think of that as almost like a protective gesture, like for a performer. Just
So
because
let's talk about that aspect a little bit more, because there's so much in this work in terms of your thinking and your research. I'd love to start breaking it down a little bit. So let's start with sort of the hidden figure, so to speak, in this piece, which is the one and only Tina Turner. Can you talk about the role that Tina Turner plays in the development of this piece and how your work has thought about her over the last 6 years?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work about just this idea of like ambient structures or like infrastructures, and the way that those things are always the product of some like pre-existing set of political or social beliefs. And so Tina Turner for me was always this sort of like ambient figure, like throughout my childhood. Like she was just always there. Like I remember being like 4 or 5 years old. I don't remember how old I would have been, maybe younger than that. And like seeing the Private Dancer music video on television, and my mom being like, you cannot watch that. But like she was always this figure that was very present for me, who I would always hear, but often was not supposed to see. and so from a very early age, she just became this kind of figure that was always around. And, you know, I like some of her music. I don't love all of it, but I think like as a figure to identify with, she opens up a lot of possibilities for thinking about things like gender-based violence, misogynoir, segregation and racism in the music and recording industry, sexism, in many ways like queerness. Like she occupies this sort of identity that is often described as like a very kind of masculine way of performing, because it's so energetic and it's not like polite. And so she is often a figure that I come back to and reference in my work. Like one of the earliest pieces I made was this little like fabric work on canvas that was just sort of like a crop of that famous shingle dress that I made in like I think it was 2014, 2013. So it's been about 6 or 7 years that I've been going back and forth making work about Tina Turner. And today actually was the publication day for this new essay I've been working on for almost 2 years with Triple Canopy, called Little Girls. That's tracing the history of the song River Deep Mountain High, which is this very sort of notorious Phil Spector production that Tina recorded. It was the first recording she'd made without Ike. So it was this really kind of like huge turning point for her in terms of what she, in terms of how she viewed herself and saw herself like as a recording artist, and her relationship to the genre of R&B versus the genre of pop or rock music. And the song was largely like a commercial failure in the US. And a lot of that, by many historians, is attributed to the fact that radio stations were so segregated that they didn't know how to deal with the song, because it was like a white pop producer working with this huge R&B singer. So no one knew how to categorize it. So it just got kind of left in the dust because of that, because of the inability to kind of create these structures that make things like that more legible.
Can we talk a little bit about protest and Tina Turner, or rather Refusal and Tina Turner? Because I want to get into protest as a separate idea in a minute, but I want to talk about Tina and Refusal, because there's things that you brought to light to me about her biography that I didn't know, that really made me see her in a different light. And I want to talk about the way, in particular, Refusal and Tina Turner works in this piece.
Yeah. So one of the really big things Thank you. I'm so glad that you're asking these questions in this way, because I can really go off on a tangent. Okay. So refusal. This is a really big topic for me as someone who works in abstraction, especially as like a Black queer woman who works in abstraction and sort of does not use figures in my work. I think a lot about what that signifies in terms of refusing the figure, sort of refusing to use that as a vehicle for creative production. And it's something that is really, it becomes really loaded for me when I think about different types of performance in terms of like the figure and the stakes of visibility, or what that exchange is, and how it's very different depending on the body and the figure one occupies. And so with Tina, like the thing about Tina's sort of career is that she retired, which I think is very kind of unusual given just the way that the music and recording industry works. It's extremely extractive and can be really detrimental and lethal for people. Like I think about Whitney Houston and Prince and Michael Jackson. Like I think about all these huge stars. I mean, even like Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, we can open it up. But like, I think about those like politics of visibility and the kind of labor that's associated with performance. Because I know I can speak for myself personally, and I imagine many other people probably relate to this, but when you're seeing someone performing and you're getting pleasure out of it, it's often lost on you that you're witnessing someone working. Like performance is a very like highly aestheticized, satisfying type of labor that we get to engage in. And I use the word engage really specifically because I think as members of an audience, or as people who occupy like the space of the audience, or as a public, there is, I think, a huge responsibility in recognizing that, and sort of recognizing that sometimes in these systems where power is at play in these different ways, that there's a lot of value in showing up to things. Like your presence is just as valuable, I think, as the performers in many ways. And so I think about that in terms of like, you know, the value that gets bestowed on like a social media platform. Like your presence, regardless of how you engage with it, is, you know, giving value to that system. And so I think like the presence of listeners, or the presence of audiences in these systems of listening, like in the recording industry, actually like bring a lot of value and speak. Like there's a lot of power in that, in like just showing up or listening, or like, you know, streaming the song or buying the record.
And you talk about that dynamic between audience and performer, or performer and spectator. Yeah. And it undergirds this work, but it also undergirds in some more explicit ways the work that you did at PS1. So as you were preparing for our show together, you were also preparing for the presentation of work at PS1. Can you talk about those two works and how they are in conversation with one another?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, I want to shout out Taja Cheek, PS1 curator, Alex Rosenberg, PS1 producer, the whole team.
Shout about.
I just want to shout it.
As we're talking about
I got to get
labor.
a list. I'm going to pull up my list. There's so many people. Yeah, with that, so I'll talk about audiencing a little more specifically for a moment, maybe tie the two together. But with that work, I wanted to create a scenario where just the formal elements of a kind of like a live music performance were literally inverted. So in that piece, when you walk in as an audience member, you're directed to sit underneath the stage structure that's vaulted about, I think it's like a solid 8 or 9 feet, like above your head. and you're sitting in the spiral formation. There's usually about 40 people. And because you're sitting in a spiral formation, it means that you're all looking at each other for this 45-minute duration. 46 minutes is kind of like the sweet spot, because that's roughly the duration of a music album. And I think that also kind of pushes at the boundaries of what people's attention spans are at this point. But the thing about that spiral formation is that it kind of forces you to simultaneously be looking at this image of others that's being created for you just through the performance, while also recognizing that you're a part of that image for someone else. And so there's this kind of like reflection of identification, or like these different images, this multitude of images that are being created for everyone. So there's no single perspective. It's sort of like the space where a multitude of perspectives get to exist in the same space. And so because of that, it's sort of, I think for me and for a number of people I've spoken to who experienced the piece, it kind of unlocks some sense of, I don't want to say passivity, but it sort of changes the stakes, I think, of like what it means to be a member of an audience, or what it means to like listen to something. And so the things that you are actually listening to is kind of this mashup of a number of different like political speeches, scientific texts about like listening and like social relations. There's some podcast stuff in there. It's just sort of like almost like a listening workout. So you're constantly having to sort of regroup and identify differently to everything that you're listening to. So everyone's having a different experience. That's kind of what I was thinking about, like going into that work. Those were some of the objectives.
And can you talk about the role of listening in Private Dancer? Because this is actually something that I have struggled to language, which is there is an unheard soundtrack. We do not hear the soundtrack of Tina Turner's Private Dancer, but the work is not silent, right?
Yeah.
So can we talk about sound and the way that sound performs perhaps in this piece, or maybe some of the ways that you've thought about sound as a tool, or how it functions for you?
So the big word I will use is consequences. Think a lot about consequences and sound in relation to consequences. And so with this work, I mean, essentially what you're experiencing when you walk into the space are the consequences of sound being mediated through this program in this way. So consequences, I mean, effects could be another word, but I really think that consequences feels like more like a more, I don't know, encompassing term in some ways. Because I think a lot about like the consequences of materials, or the consequences of like engaging with certain structures or materials in certain ways. And so with this structure, that's like these lighting trusses, which are these like infrastructural things that we just that just sort of get absorbed into the background of a performance. They're just used to kind of prop up or focus you more on the figure. Like I wanted to think about just the consequences of reworking what that relationship is. And I mean, it's another word that I've just been thinking a lot about in terms of the conversations that we're having now around abolition and destruction of institutions that no longer, or that have never really served many of us. And so I really like thinking about, I don't know, just sort of like the consequences of this ruined structure. And like,
there's two parts of that I want to tease out a little bit. One is this concept of ruin, right? Which is these collapsed lighting trusses are literally, as you said, the fallen infrastructure of a music performance, but they also give the impression of a collapsed body. So there's this equation of ruin and exhaustion. And I think when you conceived of the piece as a culture and as a society, I think we had a different relationship to ruin than we have now, 6 months into global pandemic, to racial reckoning and the uprising for Black lives. And what we see as a real collapse, like you said, of structures that have not been serving many of us for a long time. I'd really love to tease out sort of how those ideas are functioning in the work, but also how the work has changed a little bit, right? Like there's so many aspects of this work to me that are so incredibly prescient, right? There's like this sense of ruin. There's this question of like the collective of music concerts. Well, right now, absolutely no one is experiencing music concerts or large events in the same way that they were 7 months ago. Can you just talk a little bit about how that's functioning for you now and maybe the new valences that the work has picked up as time has unfolded? Because I think that's really fascinating that a work can begin about one thing, and as we live with it, it starts to show that it's actually about many other things. And maybe some of those things were embedded in your thinking from the start, but they've grown, or different parts of the work may have grown or may have shrunk.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of putting it. Like different parts definitely have like been thrown into greater relief like at this point versus at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about, you know, artworks in general is that they're social objects. You know, they change over time given the context. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of quarantine, like in March when we were installing, I was thinking very specifically about structures that I could create that felt like they were protecting, it was some kind of protective gesture for a performer. And so the way that I initially was going, sort of like getting at that idea, was to just see what happened if I removed the performer. And I just imagined, we don't know where the performer is. Maybe they're just relaxing. They're taking a bath. We don't see them. There's no body, which means that they're probably okay wherever they are, hopefully. And so it was very like, it was really specifically just like a sort of protective gesture. Like I just didn't want to see people working and people being like made visible in this way where like the stakes and the rules of engagement are so murky. Like people could be getting completely different things out of viewing, you know, a Black body. Like I think about Dave Chappelle actually, and when he was talking about how like there was this one day where he was doing a stand-up routine and there were some people in the front, like some white guys or something, who were just laughing a little too loudly at the joke, and he felt like there was something about the stakes of his performance that didn't feel good to him. And so there's just something about that for me, like about that idea of it's almost like there's something sort of carceral about being made visible or being made legible when it's not on your own terms. And so my way of dealing with that, just as a starting point, is just to remove the figure and take a look at all these other materials that are around the figure, because that's the structure that kind of, you know, determines the relationships between performers and those who are viewing them.
This is something I've been thinking about a great deal, and I think your work at working with you opened up even more, and it's something that we're going to be diving into over multiple projects at CAAM, is this question of Black abstraction and the power of Black abstraction, and the question of whether or not we have to make things legible, whether or not we have to be legible, right? Thinking precisely about what you're talking about, this fact that to be Black in this country is a condition of both hypervisibility and invisibility. And what abstraction can be for as a tool for artists. And, you know, something that really drew me to your work was the fact that you did not feel compelled to make legible all of the research and all of the thinking that went into your work. And that in fact, as a Black queer woman, that is an act of protest to refuse to make all that you have done legible for an audience or for anyone else. So that was something that was sort of always at the core for me with you. And it leads to this question of protest, right? Which came up in this question of refusal for Tina Turner. That was a type of protest, right? A type of denying of her body, a type of saying that she will separate, that she will tour when she wants to or doesn't, that she will live where she wants to. And that's not necessarily America. You know, there are all these layers of that for her. And then obviously the uprisings of this summer and protest took on a very different level of visibility for everyone in terms of this cultural moment. I'd like to hear from you a little bit about protests in this work. And, you know, I know from our conversations together that you were also a person who yourself was in the street protesting this summer. And I know the work was in some ways a way for you to work through your feelings about what constitutes protest. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about your feelings of what constituted protest at the start of the work and now how you're thinking about protest and whether there's been a shift or a change for you.
Yeah, that's a great question because man, this must have been about it's 2020. So this must have been right after the 2016 presidential election when people were just flooding the streets. And I had this feeling that I now understand a lot of my friends have had as well, which is this feeling of just alienation, like feeling like I am not identifying or feeling alienated from this idea of going into the street and being in public and taking up space in this way. And a lot of that I understand as just not always necessarily feeling safe in public spaces with lots of people, because there's a lot more at stake in being, like, as you said, like simultaneously invisible and hypervisible. And around that time, I started making work that was really trying to unpack what that feeling was about, but also I started to examine these other smaller, personal, individual, like sometimes private ways that I'd been enacting acts of refusal or protest in my own personal life, just on a day-to-day basis. And that thinking is actually what led me to make the show that I had at Commonwealth and Council at the end of 2018 called Descent. Descent as in DESCENT, but it sounds like dissent. And so it was this work about my decision to not use my legal last name. Gale is my middle name, but it's a name that my mother gave me. And so it was sort of this way of meditating and thinking about what it means to like reject these sort of like legal forms of identification, but also legal forms of identification that also overlap with genealogy. And for most Black Americans, like a history of going from like being a descendant of someone's property or an item on a ledger to like, you know, a human being or being recognized as such. And so, yeah, like that, like I've been doing a lot of work around just recognizing these moments, like expanding the definition of what constitutes protest or what constitutes refusal. And so with Tina, like she's just, you know, she's one of these figures, like, she's from Tennessee. And I say this because I've recently been listening to this amazing podcast called Dolly Parton's America. And there's this thing where Dolly is like, really, she does not identify as a feminist, despite the fact that other people like project that onto her. And so I say that to say, like, I am not sure if Tina identifies as a feminist or like identifies as any of these things that I'm projecting onto her, but she becomes this really sort of incredible, like her persona becomes this great figure to kind of think through these ideas with. Like in a recent interview she did, someone asked her if she would ever come out of retirement to perform again. And she said this thing that just blew my mind that I love. She was like, if people want to see me perform, they can just go on YouTube and watch the videos. That's what I do. I'm not coming out of retirement. Like, I'm chilling in my castle in Switzerland. That's what I'm doing. I'm resting. And I think that, like, just this idea of resting or just not working is really powerful. There's actually this excerpt, there's this moment in Toni Morrison's Jazz where the main character, Violet, she's walking in the middle of the street and then she just stops walking and she just kneels down and she just stops. And like these police come up and try to like give her a hard time, and these other people just in the city sort of gather around her and protect her and just say like, leave her alone. She's not doing anything. She's just resting. So I think she's just being. And I think that's really, yeah.
So you read a great deal, right? There's a lot of literary references in this work, and literary references work their way into much of your work. And when we touched base earlier this week, you said something really interesting to me about quotation. And that was different for me than how I had been thinking about literary reference. Can you talk a little bit about the specificity of quotation and what that form means to you and how it's working within your practice?
Yeah, sorry, there's an ice cream truck going by, if you can hear that. It's like an ice cream truck, a motorcycle.
It's a Zoom life.
Yeah, it's a Zoom life. Oh, wow. Yeah. So I'll start with this. So a few weeks ago, I was invited by this really cool organization, Black Lunch Table, to do like one of their Instagram live takeovers. And I thought it would be a cool opportunity to sort of go through my video archive, because I have this sort of really big archive of all these performances of mostly like Black women entertainers and artists. And I wanted to just make something really simple that turned into a much more elaborate thing. But one of the things I started to notice as I was going through this archive is that there was this conversation that just almost started to just, I don't want to use the word magic, but there's something that was just in the ether. Like it was just like a conversation that started to emerge between all of these women that was really striking, just in like some of the gestures or the performances or the songs or even some direct references to one another. So it was like they were speaking to each other in this really incredible, almost like uncanny way. And I started to think a lot about this idea of, I don't know, like inheritance, but also citation, and the way that citation becomes this really powerful form of like, not only like paying respect or something, but also just like moving forward and like bringing your ancestors with you or something, or like I think there's something really important about like recognizing that history and sort of finding ways to bring it forward or bring it with you, or like pointing to where things came from, not as a means of like attributing ownership or something, but just to say, this is something that inspired me, this is something that's important to me, and it deserves recognition. And yeah, it was just really like that project sort of like opened up this whole conversation or idea for me around citation, because I recall like when I was like much younger, I recall also having like some ideas around citation and thinking about how it can be this very political form of engagement with materials and with history, by like recognizing something as like through citation, it's almost like you're recognizing something as foundational. Like Tina Turner becomes like a foundational figure and creator for me in the work I'm doing.
In the academic frame, citation is what we learned so early on as a way of saying this thing is valid and I'm indebted to it. So
Absolutely.
I think this idea, this video, when you were telling me about it, I was just so enamored of the idea of various Black women through history talking about one another and saying, I see you, you are seen, and I feel seen because of your existence. Right? That's something that I think is such a beautiful way in which quotation can function, which is a type of recognition, as you say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's also just making me realize that just like as someone who works fairly minimally and like abstractly, often like it's only through these conversations or like through writing or through things that are not like, you know, the art objects that I actually get the opportunity to sort of cite those sources or make references to those things and people and like contemporaries. I think it's so important, like when we're making things that become a part of an archive, to just, you know, name people, because you just never know like how that information might help someone like 20 or 50 or 100 years down the line. Like I was just
thinking so much about that, about access to archives and visibility in archives, how we learn our history, how it's framed, and really by whom. And I think there is something so powerful in the gesture of us citing one another, which is very distinct, in a way in which we gain access to the archives of our existence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just reading this interview that Barbara Chase Rabeau had done in Moose magazine like a year or two ago. And she talks about, I didn't know this, maybe some other people watching knew this, but she talks about how Toni Morrison edited her book on Sally Hemings and like encouraged her to like write the book. And I mean, Toni Morrison did that for so many people when she worked as a literary editor. And it's just like, I don't know, that goes, I think it ties into archive, like the importance of, you know, having people who are creating that space for others to even be documented or be a part of the archive. But yeah, it's so important.
And as you know, my work for a long time has been in digital publishing before coming to CAAM. And one of the things that COVID and the museum being closed has changed is about how we think about the potential of our website, which allows me to start getting my wheels turning again about all of those delicious things that come from the context that publishing provides, but specifically that digital publishing provides, because it allows us to have these, like, I think real snapshot moments. They're just part of like the relationship to ephemera and digitization, or digital publishing, that I'm actually really excited now for us to be digging into even more, as we're going to be extending Nikita's show through the spring. So that folks will be able to experience it in person, and also now really actively thinking about the layers of context and how we can bring, you know, things like the things we're talking about in this conversation to digital platforms, I think, to give the work even more depth of understanding for folks, and to also position, I've really been thinking about this idea of archives in a constellation, right? That, like, your work or any artist's work, there is the image making or the object making, or however that's defined.
Right.
And then there's the constellation of ideas and references and histories and other images that work is in conversation. And I know that's a conversation that you take very seriously. It's one that we've been working through tonight, but there's something to me that's so exciting about this opportunity to think more broadly for more of the artists that we're working with about the constellation in which they're working, as a way of giving space and context and history to the work of Black artists in a way that I think can be very meaningful in thinking about the expansion and access to the archive.
Yeah.
It's been on my mind.
No, I mean, I think it's like a really, in some ways, it's a really exciting time. And there are a number of, I'm just thinking about, like, this is making me want to like think about some like really interesting publishing projects and like artists who are doing that stuff. Like, I think of like Sisters with Invoices and, you know, Candace Williams, Cassandra Press, which is just so far ahead of the curve. It's crazy.
And Candace is somebody that I've been in deep conversation with about this work, and I'm looking forward to working with more.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's just so much. There's so many. I mean, for me, like when I think about like how my work functions and how it relates to like an archive, or like to also like touch on that idea of citation again. Like, I really have always loved this idea of like the Trojan horse or the entry point, you know, like this obsession that I tend to have with certain types of materials or objects. Always, like, I always start with this mantra or this idea that desire is data. Like, if I'm interested in something, if there's something about it that I just find really compelling from a very like visceral place, that is so much, there's so much information there, because it's like like that response is something that is based on my particular history and my particular like development as like the social political subject. And there's actually this thing that a former professor and mentor of mine, Andrea Fraser, who's like really incredible performance artist, would say sometimes when we were having studio visits, which is, it's like she was referencing Bourdieu, who was referencing like Bachelard. And she says that the quote is something like, we're all particular instances of the possible. And so there's something about that I find really beautiful, and just thinking about how we engage with history or with spaces or with politics. It's all sort of like this, we're all these just little nodes that have slightly different experiences that then like through coming together produces some other thing. And so I think of that also as just like, we're all going to engage with archives in different ways and engage with history in different ways. And it just continues to produce these like infinite possibilities. So I think like, I feel excited about what like expanding access to some of these archives or information would actually produce.
Also makes me think about the role of multiplicity of perspective, which, you know, plays a role in Private Dancer, you know, the different vantage points by which you experience the work. And obviously in the work at PS1, the ways in which perspective is playing. But there's something that I think draws attention to the multiplicity of perspectives, which is the most important thing, right? Is that we are constantly living. We are constantly living in this frame where there's many different ways to look at things. And we are just kind of our little nodes moving through with our own limited or expansive perspective, depending on the day usually.
Yeah, totally. And like, when you think about that, you start to recognize like how lacking so many of the infrastructures that we rely on are in terms of being able to hold
space for multiplicity.
Hold space
especially
for that.
The multiplicity of Black folks, to hold space for that.
Yeah.
Really,
yeah. I mean, reading Claudia Rankine's new book right now, and it's just like, I was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is, I mean, I love her work so much, but it's about that very thing, like the sort of multiplicity and the kind of failure of all these infrastructures that have been relied on for so long to provide us with these things that they were never intended to provide us with.
So speaking of readings and I think the failure of infrastructure, you shared with me a piece by Adrian Piper, a eulogy of sorts for Aretha Franklin. And I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit from that or share your thoughts on that. But it was a very powerful moment, I think, for thinking about quotation and respect and infrastructure failure and so many of these things that have come up again and again in this conversation tonight.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would love to read some of that. I mean, it's really short. Should I just read the whole thing? Do people want to sit and listen? Okay.
And if folks, before Nikita begins to read, if folks want to put some questions in the Q&A, we can open that up to your questions for Nikita as well.
Okay, so this is in the passages section of Art Forum. It's like a short kind of eulogy that Adrian Piper wrote for Aretha Franklin on August 17th, 2018. So I'll start here. Quote, "Where I live now, respect is what we say to express surprise, admiration, and respect for a person's achievement. In my country of origin, in the 1970s, respect was my infallible litmus test for culling those with whom friendship was possible, from those who didn't know who Aretha Franklin was, or who looked with distaste or condescension on her magisterial achievements, or who openly derided them as jungle music. Among those who passed that first test, those with whom friendship was likely had to either move to the beat spontaneously, or at least be willing to learn. That learning process cemented several long-term friendships over the years. It always culminated in that joyous moment of moving to it, or jumping to it, as Aretha would put it in the 1980s, clapping to it, stamping to it, singing to it, and meaning it. That is the way her voice, her music, and her meaning gave meaning to my life, providing even in the most parched and deadening moments the narrative of rhythm, syncopation, movement, and song that helped me make sense of what was happening to me and celebrate my detachment from it. I often danced to her albums taped onto cassettes in my Sony Walkman for solace in the privacy of my living room. By the time I saw her live on Cape Cod in the late 1990s, we both had been through several rough patches and her eyes were empty. By that time, she had perfected her instruments so thoroughly that her voice could sing her songs automatically with heart and soul and that addictive polyrhythmic inflection to all of the instruments that supported her through all of her greatest hits and more great songs that hadn't been hits for arbitrary reasons, while her spirit stood by and watched with detachment. Herself was in her voice, not in her body. And by that time, her voice had so thoroughly become my voice, speaking for me as well as to me, that I was able to take it with me in the 2000s when I left, successfully sneaking it through customs along with the rest of me. She spoke for all of us for whom the collateral damage of our personal lives is a mere succession of footnotes to the persistent and all-engulfing stream of self-expression that propels us through, above, and beyond the beginnings of life, up to and past the end of it. None of those personal collisions ever made even a dent in her artistic brilliance. She always had her priorities straight. In recent years, I've heard her voice less frequently. I'm more attentive now to the tonal and rhythmic flowerings of experimental collaboration among digital composers from widely different cultures in Europe, Africa, and Asia, many of whom draw their inspiration from Aretha's musical tropes. When I do hear her, I'm reminded of all she embodied in her work as well as her life, and all of the historical moments at which her work gave embodiment to mine. And I can't avoid reiterating a question, the answer to which should be self-evident, but is not. as to whether the extraordinarily original and potent contribution of African-American music to global culture justifies the pain and brutality of American racism, without which it would not have existed. I cannot imagine how a world without Aretha could possibly have been a better one.
It's so powerful. Do you want to share
really
a couple
incredible.
reflections on it?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that's so striking is just, again, like to go back to this idea of citation, to kind of, especially for someone like Adrian Piper, who's so specific in terms of like how she engages with and is sort of recorded in the archive, to kind of create this archival object that really recognizes like her connection to this pop music artist, and to sort of like pay respect in that way. So that's the first thing that's really striking to me about it. But then it's that last passage that is just so huge. It's just like this question of, you know, making the decision between a world without Aretha, or like a world in which these sort of like creative contributions, as a result of this sort of like violence and oppression, it's sort of like, I don't know, there's something really complicated about that.
It's a question fundamentally of consequences.
Yeah, you're right. It is. It's a really good.
My partner has been watching the NBA playoffs, and so I sit and I take it in. I don't necessarily always know what's going on, but I take it in, and he loves it. And one of the commentators said, "Without Black lives, America doesn't matter." And for me, that take on the concept of Black Lives Matter and that framing, I had not heard anybody use that phrase in that way, and maybe others have, but just the stark reality of without Black lives, America doesn't matter. That's the thing that I think about when I think about that final paragraph of Adrian Piper, that we have been the target of so much violence and so much oppression, and still the center of culture. And still like the rose growing through the concrete that makes this country matter artistically, culturally. And that to me is this extraordinary tension that I think we're all living with. We have been living with for far too long, but are living with in very acute ways in this very, very moment as we think about the future that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just bringing to mind this this concept that I've been thinking about a lot, and I've been working on like a couple of new projects around this idea, but it's a term that I encountered in reading. Like I recently, a couple of months ago, started reading Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and the way that he writes is just like so poetic and like creative, and like the aesthetics are just so crazy. But he talks about this Black mass, which he's referring to initially as just like the mass of freed slaves who represented like a Black labor force. But then he starts to trace the way that this mass has always sort of been the source from which all of these other things are culled for like creative production or industrial production or like capitalism. And I think about that idea a lot, like this mass that's just like sort of looked at as sort of like infinitely reproducing resource, because it's like, because if the violence continues, it's like that mass kind of like continues to grow or like maintain the same volume or size. It's just like there's just violence in things that maintain it in different, more sophisticated ways over time. And so yeah, it's like this idea of the black mass, because it's just like, yeah, like black life without black, I mean, black life basically allowed this country to pretty much time travel. It's like, how does a country that's less than 300 years old have the largest economy in the world? You know, you sort of like ask yourself these questions, and it's like, oh, yeah, it typically comes back to one answer.
I'm reading Kindred right now, so thinking a lot about time travel.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of books, we have a couple questions that I just want to clarify. Is
Okay.
Just Us the title of the Claudia Rankine book that you're reading right now?
Just Us. Yep.
Yes, that is the
Yep.
book.
Yeah.
And to clarify, the piece that you just read by Adrian Piper was published in Artform. So it's in the passages section of Artform right after Aretha Franklin's death.
Yep.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Nikita, if nothing else emerges, I want to end on looking forward. So
Yeah.
what's next for you, or what's something that you're excited about? It can be in your work or some other factor of your life. It's all fair game, but looking to the future, what are you thinking about?
Oh, what am I thinking about? What am I looking forward to? I am working on a project I feel pretty excited about that's coming out later. It's still September. This will be October. I'm making this online digital project with this gallery, Cloaca Projects in San Francisco. And it's a project that is a collaboration with this really amazing sound artist, Wizard Apprentice, who I also want to shout out. And this designer, Andreas Tager. And I was able to work with the June Jordan Foundation on this, which I'm also really excited about. And it's a project that's sort of based around this poem called Letter to the Local Police that June Jordan wrote. And it's this very, kind of like in the sarcastic June Jordan tone. And it's a person who's writing to their local police department about these roses that are growing out of control in their neighborhood, and they're just freaking out about it. I won't go into too many details, but I'll be posting about the project once it's up. But I'm pretty excited about that. There's a group show I'm in at Tanu Banakdar that's curated by my friends Tano and Kelly. That's opening this weekend. I'm working on a project with Hamza Walker at LAX Art. It'll probably be next year. Things are being postponed too, so that's the other thing. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm forgetting a lot of stuff too. Those are the things that immediately come to mind. I feel bad because I probably forgot some really big thing. I have quarantine brain.
I'm so excited about that June Jordan project and the rose. I can't wait to see how that develops. There's one more question that we have here.
Hear the rooster?
I did just hear Rooster talking about sounds.
That's Carrie Mae Weems. That's the rooster's name.
That's the rooster's name.
Might have to rename him because I don't like it. I mean, he does it really early in the morning at like 5 a.m.
We have one question. So we talked a little bit about this, but a person has a specific question about the relationship between architectural ruin to your work. And they are thinking specifically about the Sphinx or buildings they've observed in Detroit. Is there a link between your work and objects like that?
Yeah, there is actually. That's something that I think about quite a bit, at least from the term of like, when you think about architectural spaces, they are just inherently social spaces. And so they end up essentially being like reflections or manifestations of like the social, like the beliefs of the people who are designing them. And so I think there is like a really close link between thinking about other sorts of infrastructure and specifically like architecture as in like buildings and dwellings. I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe it's.
I think it does.
Okay.
One more question. Silence is violence is the phrase resounding in battling racism in this country. I wonder if you believe that holds true for the Black creative. If existing and resisting involves silence, can these coexist?
I think they can. And I think, I don't even know if it's so much about like a coexistence, because there are so many different gradients, like in this idea of silence and like noise or sound. Like for one thing, true silence like really does not exist anywhere. It's more of like this idea of like a lack of sound in many ways. But like when I'm referring to silence, I think what I'm really thinking about is a kind of pause or a sort of rest. I mean, that idea rest, or that word rest even, is really important, because even in like Western musical notation, the notation of a rest actually indicates when you're not playing your instrument. And so, yeah, like that idea of silence is violence. I mean, inaction has different repercussions depending on who is not acting or who is not speaking. And typically that's something I think that is linked to how much authority or power someone has in a given context, and how much of an ability they have to like make change or influence things. And so I think that phrase, while it's like really catchy and makes sense in some circumstances, I think it's also really sort of complicated. And as we were saying, it's like we're all these different instances of the possible, or we all have these different like relationships to authority, and to oppression. And so like our various ways of being silent or making noise all register differently.
Thank you, Nikita, for answering my questions tonight and for answering the questions from our audience. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you.
I know, it's so great. I'm so glad we did this. I was like looking forward to this. I was really nervous in the beginning. I was like, oh my God, like I was chill. And then like 5 minutes before, I just...
Folks at home may not know that when Nikita and I get together, we just can talk. We could just like talk for hours and hours and hours.
This could go on for much longer.
So it's nice to be here experimenting with talking in public. So much of what we talk is, full of our tee-heeing and our private confessions and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
so it's interesting to think about how our conversation turns over to this frame.
Right.
But again, thank you all so much for being here. And Nikita, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cameron, for inviting me to make this work, for creating a space for it to be possible, for all the support. Alexandra, Jenny Bias, the install team, Ed. I'm trying to shout everyone out.
Everyone, shout them all out.
Yeah.
So many different folks' labor went into making this possible, which is true every time you visit a museum, even if some of that work is made invisible. So many people's work and labor and thought goes into producing these things. So thank you again. Alexandra, do you have anything that we need to hear from you on before we sign off?
No, always lovely listening to you both and talking with you both as well. This has felt like a special treat for me. I feel like I'm smarter just from listening to both of you tonight. So really appreciate that. But no, thank you both. We hope that you all will join us in the future for other programs. So please keep an eye out on our website and our social media. Please do follow Nikita also to keep up with her and her brainy activities and her brilliance. And we look forward to welcoming you hopefully sooner than later back to CAAM. And that's it. Alrighty, we'll see you all soon. Have a great rest of your night.
Good night.
Cheers.
Night.